This is very much an off-brand topic for the channel, but I wanted to spend some time reflecting on perhaps my favourite genre of titles, the strategy RPG, and how Nintendo might be dealing with them going forward, plus what they might learn from one of my favourite examples of the genre. I first discovered tactics RPGs with a game that may still be my favourite of all time, the wondrous Shining Force 2 on the Sega Mega Drive, and by the team which is now called Camelot Software Planning. And then I also loved its follow-up, the magnificent Shining Force 3, two-thirds of which was never even localized in the West. I've played Shining Force 2 so often that it's difficult to disaggregate the raw quality of the title from childhood nostalgia, but because of the Shining Force 3 fan translation project, I revisited and completed Shining Force 3 many years after it first released and as an adult, and I do think that that game really feels modern and forward-thinking in many ways, even by today's standards. Of course, since then I've tried several other strategy titles, but truth be told, not many have scratched the itch in the same way. Triangle Strategy had decent combat mechanics, but I personally found the storyline dragged, not helped by the fact that the cutscenes were absolutely endless. Mysteria was really good fun, but lacked polish. Langrisser was also good, but different in its own way. Final Fantasy Tactics I'm very much looking forward to playing in September since, as I never owned a PlayStation, I never got into this series. And then of course I've played many, though by no means all, the Fire Emblem titles. I really like Fire Emblem, but I don't love Fire Emblem. And so today I wanted to consider why and what it is that Fire Emblem is missing for me, and how Nintendo might shape their tactics offerings going forward. Now here's the thing, this is not pitting Shining Force against Fire Emblem. Fire Emblem has a very passionate and dedicated fan base who like the series for what it is, so this video is not wishing Fire Emblem were something else, which would be unfair. That said, I do think that there is a gap in the tactics market for a type of game which I'm not really sure has existed since Shining Force. Whether Nintendo would ever want to try to fill that niche, given that they already have something broadly in the same genre, I don't know, and I'll speculate about how they might achieve this at the end of the video. However, first let's unpick what makes these Shining titles stand out, and when I say the Shining titles, I am referring specifically to the Camelot Software Planning designed Shining Force games ending with 1999's Shining Force 3 Scenario 3, not any other Camelot games such as Shining the Holy Ark or Shining Wisdom, which, while fantastic, were different in terms of their genre, and not the many titles that have been released under the Shining brand in the 2000s, but with different developers from the original Camelot team and with different styles, and that Sega have released broadly to some success in Japan, but also broadly to indifference in the West. I guess the first thing that's different about Shining Force compared to other tactics titles is in tone. Shining Force is latterly compared to Fire Emblem, but to be honest, the developers actually quoted its twin inspirations as Langrisser and Dragon Quest, and I think the latter influence is severely underestimated. There is a wonderful warmth and humour and vibrancy to Dragon Quest, which few RPGs even attempt to match these days, and fewer still find success with. Still, in the world of more traditional turn-based RPGs, it's possible to think of quite a few titles, indie and non, which have bright and engaging and fantastical worlds. I've yet to find time to play Sea of Stars, but it does look amazing. But the Dragon Quest elements lead to a world in Shining Force where dragons and golems, giant tortoises and robots, zombies, birdmen, wolfmen, fairies, and more centaurs than you ever thought you could fit into a video game stand alongside your standard issue tactics units. The enemies are similarly diverse, so whereas your average Fire Emblem game pits you against wave after wave of broadly generic archers, cavalry units, and spellcasters, plus the odd dragon, Shining Force has you fighting marionettes in a circus tent and so on. Golden Sun players will be familiar with the kind of quirky humour of the Camelot Software Planning team. Not quite as in-your-face and anarchic as something like Disgaea, but enough that every town and locale and encounter are filled with charisma and humour and a kind of off-kilter approach that is closer to the best of the Zelda games. Now, that's not to say that Shining Force is all happy-clappy comfort blanket stuff. Shining Force 3's complex world remains the match of any I've seen in terms of video game world building and resembles resembles nothing so much as Fire Emblem Three Houses in terms of structure, although of course Camelot already ripped themselves off for Golden Sun as well. Shining Force 3 is essentially a mini-series of 3 games or scenarios in which you take different roles on a massive interconnected world map. Fitting with Camelot's decision on their previous title, Shining the Holy Ark, to age up the Shining games to better fit the Sega Saturn audiences, this world maintains the diversity of prior titles in terms of imaginative locations and imaginative characters, but also adds in a huge amount of complexity. Like Three Houses, the different scenario leaders are often in conflict with each other, and in the same way there is, of course, a through-line story involving good versus evil and the reawakening of a terrible force of darkness. But what makes Shining Force 3 stand out to me is how brilliantly drawn each of the main locations are. Aspinia is essentially a socialist republic which has broken away from a feudal empire of Dystonia, while Saraband is a capitalist trading nation which literally floats across the sea, and the Holy Land of Elbasem is essentially a theocracy in opposition to a rival theocracy by the sect of Bullzone. Many of these locations have both good and bad sides, and none of them are given an easy ride narratively, plus there's so much corruption and backbiting and betrayal, and some interesting reflections on these struggles between idealism and pragmatism that the game takes on a lot of complexity. It's a surprisingly deep and intricate world, but if that's not your speed, you can still play as a werewolf clouting some dragons. I know many people far preferred Three Houses to Fire Emblem Engage, but what I loved about Engage was that it wore its storyline quite lightly and didn't take itself too seriously. What I appreciate about Three Houses is that there was quite a bit of depth, but I often felt it ended up rather turgid and over-sincere as a result. Of course, Three Houses and many Fire Emblem games do break up the grimness with lighter touches of their own, notably in the relationship building, and this is where the Fire Emblem games are definitely far superior to Shining Force. Shining Force 2 is especially guilty of building characters up over several battles, right until they join you, at which point they're barely heard from again. Kazin, Slade, Road, Fraser, Zink, it happens all the time. Shining Force 3 is far better at keeping the various characters involved in the narrative, especially as you can visit them in the HQ in each town and get a sense of how they're feeling and how they're reacting to current events. All the same, with dozens of characters involved, it inevitably becomes difficult to service them all in a sufficiently meaningful way. Fire Emblem often deals with this by allowing lots and lots and lots of dialogue between characters that is broadly optional but does contribute towards your statistics, but sometimes I find that this is a case of quantity over quality. Often I don't find the interaction between these characters particularly meaningful, and one benefit of Shining Force's system is that when a major main quest character joins you, you really do know them because they've often been tagging along for quite a while, and you have a good idea about who they are and where they stand. And of course, the other thing that links to this which makes Shining Force distinctive is the inclusion of Dragon Quest-style explorable towns. And this is what I find shocking about most other tactics RPGs. Being able to wander around and explore a town isn't just fun, but you can also scout out new characters, often distinguishable in Shining Force because of the important characters having portraits of their own. How exciting to wander around a village and meet someone who has a portrait, even if there's no apparent cause for them to join your ranks at present. Tactics games especially have long battles, and it breaks up the rhythms of these games considerably to have towns in between, especially when these towns are genuinely worth exploring. Forget little shining dots on a map to collect. If you see something odd looking and give it a search, you will sometimes find something really precious as a treasure in a Shining Force game. Now, this is far easier in a sprite-based game than a big 3D monstrosity, where it's less clear what you need to search, but that sense of interactivity is largely absent, I find, from a lot of other tactics titles. But what this world also gives is a sense of progression. I really like the Somniel in Fire Emblem Engage, which is a beautiful and relaxing location with lots of cool places to explore. I really didn't enjoy the monastery in Three Houses, which just felt to me rather dull. But both have the effect of condensing the geography of the world, even if you are technically moving around. With Shining Force games, you really feel like an army on the move. Shining Force 2 is particularly fun, because by the end, when you've unlocked most of the map, you can freely explore basically the whole world apart from the odd destroyed town. It doesn't do all that much, dialogue isn't necessarily updated, and backtracking isn't usually necessary, although there are a few really awesome Easter eggs and secret characters for those who choose to do it. The scale of the map never really lands for me in a Fire Emblem game because you mostly hop from battle map to battle map and the towns are rarely explorable in the same way. Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle is closer to developing an interactive map with puzzles set upon it, but where the battles are also set, but of course it doesn't have towns and there's not really much in the way of characterization. Shining Force also uses a very elegant cheat, which is not unique to RPGs, but I think is relatively rare in tactics titles where the characters in the overworld are made giant size, meaning that they can traverse huge distances. This is an elegant way to allow battles with real diversity of terrain. It's not uncommon for an overworld battle to include deserts, mountains, lakes, forests, and grassland all in the same map, and this has an impact on the terrain effects and the tactics required as a result. Another aspect of the Shining games that I really appreciate is the simplicity of the game systems. While there are some quite complicated mechanics in the games, especially in the third title, these take the Dragon Quest approach of trying to be as intuitive and fun and streamlined as possible, certainly compared to the kind of thing you see in Fire Emblem and especially Xenoblade, where those games are clearly designed for obsessives to have plenty to master. Nothing wrong with that at all, of course, but it can be a little overwhelming, and I think there is a place for something a little more streamlined as an offering. So characters in the Shining game have 4 item slots only and can master 4 spells only, although sometimes at particular points there are ways that you can sacrifice spells to add new ones, although you don't have a great deal of control over how this works. This makes the options you do have a lot more meaningful, and also means that even potentially quite similar units can feel very different. A wizard with mainly status effect spells and a wizard with lots of different elemental spells with broad areas of impact will be different in terms of the way they play from each other, and the elemental attack spells may cover a large area of effect, dishing equal damage, whereas sorcerers can summon spells with more raw power, but the damage will be shared across all the characters in range. Sometimes I feel in other RPGs that the characters are endlessly fungible and customizable if you put in enough effort. But in Shining Force games, you kind of have to make do with what you're given, and the game is as much about coping with the characters' limitations as it is about optimizing and refining them. One thing I especially love in tactics RPGs is where the battles have been set up to make you feel smart for the strategies that you use. Advance Wars games are the absolute best at this, forcing you to master very specific and tricky strategies to claw incredible victories out of risky maneuvers. A lot of tactics battles in Shining Force, as much as any series, are just kind of open affairs where you don't need to think too much about any grand strategy as long as you're making progress and keeping an eye on things. The Shining Force series has more battles that feel memorable for the aesthetics, but this doesn't always translate to innovation. One of the best battles in Shining Force 2 involves you shrunk down and battling a chess set. But while it's a fun and a surprisingly tough battle, the pieces don't really behave like chess pieces, and so the challenge is more crossing the board before a large and dense army coalesces around the king than it is about using particularly innovative and different tactics because of the chess aesthetic. However, in Shining Force 3, there are a few battles which really stand out. My absolute favourite involves a train which make steady progress through the map at the end of each turn. On one side of the train line, a group of refugees are being chased by soldiers. Rescuing the refugees is optional, but if you want to do this, you need to move your fastest units. Only 4 or 5 can manage it to the opposite side of the track to flip the switch and divert the train onto a different course. However, this will isolate your forces on one side of the train line from the group that are on the other side of the train line for a good chunk of the battle. And it also means that the train will now cross in front of the refugees, so the refugees have to bolt across the train track in time. The effect of this is to carve up a singular map into little zones where you have to employ specific tactics to deal with an ever-changing situation. This is far from the only game to use this kind of innovation. I love the way triangle strategy would often involve environmental effects like burning houses as part of a strategy, and of course the old refugee saving, thief stopping mechanics are now well worn in many different tactics titles. But all this feels to me very, well, Nintendo-ish in Shining Force. Think of Pikmin's Dandori battles, or indeed Zelda's shrines and temples. Nintendo titles want you to take the mechanics you already know and then they innovate around them and force you to deal with those complications in interesting ways. And look, these kinds of innovative battles are rare in any tactics title, including the Shining Force series, and that's not much of a surprise as I'm sure they're very tough to think up. But I feel like there is a lot more scope for battles to do more creative things with the environment, and on those rare occasions where Shining Force has you, for example, racing to unblock a dam to flood away a monster you're only managing to hold to a draw, it forces you to think about a greater range of factors than just pockets of skirmishes on a broadly generic map. Fire Emblem is clearly superior in many ways, I would not for a second deny that. If you want to forge long relationships with characters, deep customization, a more serious tone, and menu screens galore, then it is the clear winner. But Shining Force feels more, well, again, I feel frankly Nintendo-ish. The characters feel more iconic, there's a balance of whimsy and depth, and the world feels more interactive. I grant you that there are now a great many tactics games out there, but to me, nothing has really managed to take the spot in my heart of Shining Force, and I don't think it's just nostalgia that is behind that. So, if Nintendo were to try to emulate these characteristics, how could they do it, and in what sort of game? One option would be to bolt on the best ideas to Fire Emblem. Now, Nintendo don't tend to like to borrow from other games very much, but I do think explorable towns and an interactive world map could work well for the series as concepts in their own right, irrespective of the fact that Shining Force got there a lot earlier. Instead of a monastery, having a moving caravan that the army uses that sets up alongside each town could allow for those core functions to be maintained alongside having explorable locations. It feels to me like something like this would only add to the experience, and it could be a really good convention for the Fire Emblem games to break. On the other hand, there are certain franchises which would do well with a tactics twist. Golden Sun is the most obvious since it's also by Camelot Software Planning and is, if you switch Golden for Shining, very clearly a Shining title in all but name, from the mechanics to the battle interfaces to the Jin system, which evolves mechanics trialed in Shining Wisdom and Shining Holy Ark, to the story, to even the way the text is white on a blue background. The early Shining games were highly experimental and varied in style and scope, and it would feel very true to these roots if there were another Golden game, but with a tactics approach instead of a turn-based style. Of course, given that there hasn't been a Golden Sun title in nearly as long as a true Camelot-style Shining Force title, this would feel particularly cruel to Nintendo's loyal audience who really want a classic Golden Sun to return. There was talk that Retro Studios once pitched a Zelda title in the tactics genre as well. Zelda has quite a diverse realm, but it's not endlessly diverse, and while it would be possible to add more and more character types, indeed arguably it might be a good thing for the core titles as well, I'm not sure the kinds of battles seen in Fire Emblem and Shining Force, where you control dozens of units at once, would fit the universe so well as something closer to Mario plus Rabbids, where you control a smaller number of units, but potentially with more unique capabilities. Dungeon items like the Rock's Feather and the Hookshot could be extremely interesting equipable items in the context of a major tactics game, and I think utilising some Zelda staples from the bobbable walls to multi-level dungeons where you can fall from one level to the next could create a very different kind of tactics experience. I've long thought Splatoon also suits a tactics game, with the possible impacts of inking the terrain having huge scope for creating highly tactical battles, but while I think this would be a genius move, again, it will be a very different kind of strategy title from the kind of game that Shining Force represented. In the long term, I'm rather optimistic that there will one day be a title that scratches that Shining Force itch, not least because of the growing appetite for tactics titles and the rise of brilliant and diverse indie games on the market. Whether Nintendo will seek to fill that niche themselves, I am far less certain. Thanks for watching this slightly unusual forecast video. If you wish to like, share, comment, subscribe, and or check out the Patreon, that would be amazing. But if not, I'm just so happy you're here, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.